Hello again. The last time I wore these shades in one of my early videos, one reader wrote to me and said I looked like, or I resembled, Michael Savage, the uber ultra insane reactionary clown performance artist who used to have a brief show on MSNBC before he ruined it by doing what he does. I don't think he ruined it personally. I think he was true to his nature, but MSNBC, didn't want to deal with the heat, so they got rid of him, and is much blander for the for their efforts. But in any event, I thought, well, that's kind of a flattering thing to say. I look a bit like Michael Savage. Well, hopefully I don't sound too much like him, but nevertheless, thanks for that. And that came from California, of course, that note. Also, before I get started, I want to introduce my co-host today, which is Jupiter, an owl that I bought a long time ago, and I just found going through some old boxes. So Jupiter's going to be my co-pilot for today, which is a good thing because I want to talk about something I think Jupiter really knows that much about, which is, for one thing, newspapers. A lot of people my age and older are all up in arms that newspapers are going out of business, that the whole written journalistic record is coming to an end, that the internet has destroyed all of it, the barbarians are at the gates, the worms are licking our skulls, etc., etc., etc. I have mixed feelings about this. I mean, I grew up on newspapers, and I've learned a lot from newspapers, as we all have. I've also learned a lot of lies and was fed a ton of propaganda by newspapers, and I think we know which papers we're talking about. So I have a mixed feeling about this. On the one hand, a lot of these papers are superfluous in the age that we live in, and I'm not sorry to see them go, despite the fact that a lot of people are out of work. But like any other capitalist evolution, if you want to look at it that way, people are always out of work because the format that they're working in becomes obsolete, and newspapers in a large sense are becoming obsolete. There will always be a New York Times, there will always be a Washington Post, there will always be a Wall Street Journal, alas. On the better end of that, there will always be a Financial Times, I would imagine, or an International Herald Tribune. So newspapers will still be around. Now, what kind of news will they carry? What kind of journalism will they practice? I mean, I don't know. I mean, ideally, there's always a handful of good journalists, and if you look back at the history, at least of American journalism, you'll see that there have been some outstanding reporters and people who dug beneath the official truths and exposed the lies that the official truths are usually made up of. You don't see a lot of that anymore because there's really not a lot in it for people these days, especially with Barack Obama being our new father leader. A lot of center, liberal, even left people are really loath to go after him. I mean, they may be disappointed with some of his opinions and his actions, but as I've said before, they will always back him, especially when you have real bizarro world rightists attacking him, because they become the issue instead of what is really going on with who's running the state. Now, what does that have to do with newspapers? Well, I don't know. I mean, it has to do with propaganda, I suppose. Newspapers are essentially propaganda. I wish this was happening to local TV news. I wish they were going out of business, because I can't think of a more soul-sucking, empty experience there is than watching the local news at 11 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock or whatever it's on, and just the absolute inanity and the reinforcement of major imperial narratives, especially when it comes when they're dealing with foreign policy stories about America's wars and whatnot. It's just it's a format. Local news format is basically one for local revenue. Basically, that's it. So as long as they're making money at these things, which I imagine they are on some level, they're not going to go away. Too bad. Newspapers got to go first. And that's just the way it is, I suppose. I mean, if you remember, 20 years ago, there was an essay published in Harper's Magazine, translated in Harper's Magazine by the German philosopher writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who wrote piece called In Praise of Illiteracy, where he, I think a lot of people thought sardonically, but I thought very sincerely, was recalling an age, the pre-written age, the age of oral histories, the age of memory. We're getting back to that age again, I think, but I think it's a lot less rich than that age, because there are a lot more distractions and there are things that are dumbing us down. This kind of thing is part of it, and I'm certainly doing my part to help dumb down the discourse, it seems. But we are entering that age, and when you look at the polls, there was a Pew poll, I think a couple of weeks ago, that showed that a majority of Americans polled really don't care if newspapers go out of business, which will tell you something right there. Again, I don't know if they have the sort of nihilistic glee that I sometimes have when these things happen. I think it's just indifference. I don't think newspapers really mean that much to the average American, especially in towns where the local news is primarily about bake sales and the local high school basketball or football team or lacrosse team or what have you. I think that's the extent of their interest. Beyond that, I don't think they're really that interested. And I say this growing as a guy who grew up in the Midwest and among people like this who really don't have that much interest in what's going on nationally or internationally. And I think it shows in a lot of national trends and a lot of national opinions. So I don't really know where that leaves us in terms of gathering information or trying to find the goods on the corrupt few who run our lives and tax us. In an even larger sense, though, this indifference to newspapers going out of business is tied into another thing that I want to briefly touch on. Lack of outrage. I mean, there really is a lack of outrage in this country about what's going on, especially with AIG. Now, yeah, there is a certain level of panic and disorder about AIG using tax money to give themselves bonuses, especially people who don't even work for the thing anymore. There's a legitimate element of consternation about that, but it's capped. It's really kept in check. I mean, just the average American, I guess, feels they're just being so screwed so openly. You know, what can they do? I get emails a lot from Europe and Australia for some reason. I seem to have a lot of readers in Australia. And they ask me, they say, you know, you live in the middle of the United States, especially in an area like southeastern Michigan where the economy is absolute shit and the big three are going under. Where's the outrage? Why is there such a lack of outrage? I had one guy write to me from Paris saying if this were happening in France, there'd be 1 million people in the streets of Paris the next day, shutting down the government. That's just not how we operate in the United States. Not since the 1980s, the last I can remember. Maybe sometime in the 90s. But if you think back to the pre-Iraq War protests, I mean, they were absolutely useless. They did nothing. And I think that is dwindling, especially again under Obama. You know, a lot of people who should be out there agitating, blocking the streets, shutting down the government, petitioning the government, even on a conservative constitutional basis, are just not doing it. And they're not going to do it. For some reason, I don't know why. I think I have my theories, obviously. I think people buy into the main narrative of the United States and, you know, they don't see anything essentially structurally wrong. They just see these actors like Jim Cramer on the Jon Stewart show. If you can pin it on certain people, Madoff, people like that, if you can pin it on certain people, the system goes uncriticized or, you know, it's left off the hook and allowed to perpetuate further abuses, which it inevitably will. So, this is a long-winded way of saying that newspapers are going out of business and that people don't give a shit, and that our corporate ownership is ripping us off with its political wing led by Barack Obama and people like Chris Dodd and other wonderful friends of humanity, softening the blow for their masters, to use old Communist Party rhetoric, and selling us on the idea that somehow they're angry and they're going to fix it, but we know in our heart of hearts that's not going to happen, not unless we do something about it, not unless we really get out there and shut this motherfucker down, because unless that happens, these people just don't give a shit what we think. And that's the way it is. And I think Jupiter, you agree with that, don't you? Of course you do.